Meet the most feared psychological warrior in NFL history. Richie Incognito was terrifying, not because of his size, not because of his speed, but because he could get inside your head and destroy you from within. For over a decade, he was the most feared psychological warrior in NFL history. He made Pro Bowlers question their careers, turned all-stars into mental wrecks.
He tries to test you to see if you have enough manhood, if you have enough testosterone.
And broke more spirits than bones. Incognito didn't just play football. He played mind games at a level that made grown men scared to step on the field. This was a guy who turned trash talk into an art form.
What a block. Oh my God.
Yeah, bitch.
Who could find your deepest insecurity and weaponize it in the middle of a play. He'd research your personal life, your family, your fears, and use all of it to get under your skin. But how did a kid from New Jersey become the most hated and feared mental warrior in football? And why did his own teammates either love him or despise him with equal intensity? Richard Dominique Incognito Jr. wasn't born a monster. In fact, as a kid growing up in Englewood, New Jersey, he was pretty normal. But there was something different about young Richie. He was smart, maybe too smart for his own good. He could read people, understand their weaknesses, and he learned early that words could hurt just as much as fists. By the time he was playing high school football at Mountain Ridge in Arizona, Richie had developed a reputation, not just for being good, he was dominant on the field, but for being that guy who would mess with your head. Coaches loved his intensity, but they worried about his temper. He'd get into screaming matches with opponents, with refs, sometimes even with his own teammates. The scary part was how calculated it all was. While other players got fired up emotionally, Richie stayed cold and calculating. He studied his opponents like a chess master, looking for psychological tells and mental weaknesses. And when he found them, he exploited them ruthlessly. By his senior year, he was considered one of the top offensive line prospects in the country. But scouts had concerns about his character and intensity. Nebraska took a chance on him anyway, and that's where Richie's reputation really started to grow. As a freshman, he got on the field early, which is rare for an offensive lineman. But it wasn't just his size or strength that impressed coaches, it was his mental toughness. He could break down opponents with a combination of physical dominance and psychological warfare that nobody had seen before. Incognito became the first Husker offensive lineman ever to start a season opener in his first season. He started 13 of 14 games and was a freshman All-American. By his sophomore year, Richie was already the leader of that offensive line, and Nebraska was rolling. But it was his 2003 season that really put him on the map. He anchored one of the most dominant offensive lines in college football, helping Nebraska rush for over 200 yards per game. And all season long, opposing players and defensive coordinators were complaining about his tactics. But here's the thing, Richie was never actually breaking any rules. Everything he did was technically legal. He just understood the psychological side of football better than anyone else. He knew that if he could make you angry, make you lose focus, make you think about anything other than your assignment, he'd already won. And by his senior year in 2004, he had perfected his craft. But then, new Nebraska head coach Bill Callahan suspended him indefinitely for repeated violations of team policies and rules, the last straw being a locker room fight with teammate Grant Mulkey, as reported by ESPN. Following the suspension, Richie withdrew from the program. He briefly enrolled at Oregon, but was dismissed before ever playing a down for failing to meet conduct conditions, including anger management. Going into the NFL draft, scouts were torn. On paper, Richie was everything you wanted in an offensive lineman. 6 feet 4 inches, 320 pounds, incredibly strong, great technique, and a football IQ that was off the charts. But there were red flags everywhere, multiple incidents in college, complaints from opposing teams, and concerns about whether he could control his intensity at the professional level. Some teams took him off their draft boards entirely. But with the 81st pick in the third round of the 2005 NFL Draft, the St. Louis Rams decided to roll the dice. They saw a player who could anchor their offensive line for the next decade, and they figured they could handle whatever came with him. They were wrong. From day one, Richie was exactly what everyone expected, And worse, in training camp he got into fights with his own teammates. During practice he would target rookies and try to break them mentally. Veterans started avoiding him in the locker room. But here's the crazy part. He was really good at football. When the lights came on and the game started, Richie dominated. He pancaked Pro Bowl pass rushers, opened up holes for running backs, and protected his quarterback like his life depended on it. And all the while, he was conducting psychological warfare on a level the NFL had never seen. The stories from his early years are legendary. He would research opposing players during the week, finding out personal details about their lives, their families, their backgrounds. Then on Sunday, he'd use all of that information to mess with their heads. He knew who was going through a divorce, who had money problems, who was dealing with family issues, and he'd bring all of it up during games. It was psychological torture disguised as trash talk. By his second season, Richie's reputation was growing league-wide. Defensive coordinators started warning their players about him in meetings, but it was easier said than done. Richie had this ability to find exactly the right thing to say to throw you off your game. And once he got you rattled, he'd keep hammering until you completely lost your composure. The Rams were struggling as a team, but Richie was establishing himself as a dominant guard. But behind the scenes, things were getting out of control. Teammates complained to coaches about his behavior. Some requested not to room with him on road trips. The coaching staff was constantly having to manage situations involving Richie. By December 2009, the Rams had seen enough. After 2 personal foul headbutts against the Titans and a pattern of discipline, they released him. Just like that. One of the most dominant young offensive linemen in football was unemployed. For most players, getting cut would be a wake-up call. For Richie, it was just another challenge to overcome. The Buffalo Bills claimed him off waivers immediately.
There'll be part of society that will never give Richie Incognito a chance. And I believe
For
that's
3
a mistake.
games, they got a glimpse of what Richie could do when focused purely on football. He started 3 games, dominated, and then became a free agent when the season ended. It was a brief but important preview of what was possible. Enter the Miami Dolphins. In March 2010, they signed Richie as a free agent, and new head coach Tony Sparano thought he could handle him. It seemed like a perfect match. The Dolphins were rebuilding. They needed leadership on the offensive line, and Richie needed a fresh start. What could go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. But for the first few years, it actually worked. Richie bought into the Dolphins' culture, became a leader in the locker room, and played some of the best football of his career. He made the Pro Bowl in 2012 and was considered one of the most dominant guards in football. The Dolphins' offensive line was suddenly one of the best units in the NFL, and Richie was the unquestioned leader. Ryan Tannehill called him a great teammate and said he and Jonathan Martin were close. But beneath the surface, the old Richie was still there. He was still playing psychological games with opponents, still finding ways to get inside their heads and mess with their confidence. The difference was that now he was doing it more strategically, more intelligently. He'd studied film not just to learn opponents' tendencies, but to find their psychological weaknesses. And his teammates loved him for
Richie's
it.
definitely not that type of guy. Richie's a guy, if you had to get a guy to pick your back, I'd pick Richie. Richie be first for a couple guys. So.
Well, most of them did. Richie had this ability to motivate his guys while simultaneously destroying opponents mentally. During games, he'd be coaching up his fellow linemen, telling them exactly what to expect, exactly how to handle each situation. But when the play started, he'd turn into this psychological predator, targeting whoever was across from him. The 2013 season started like any other. The Dolphins were competitive, the offensive line was dominant, and Richie was playing at an all-pro level. But then everything fell apart in the most spectacular way possible. In October 2013, Jonathan Martin, the Dolphins' left tackle, suddenly left the team mid-season. At first, nobody knew why. Then the story came out, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. Martin accused Richie of harassment, bullying, and creating a toxic environment that made it impossible for him to do his job. The details that emerged were shocking. Text messages, voicemails,
I'm gonna slap your f***ing mouth. I'm I'm gonna slap your real mother
and
across
incidents that painted a picture of psychological abuse that went far beyond typical NFL hazing. The NFL launched a full investigation, and what they found was disturbing. For months, the most feared psychological warrior in NFL history had been targeting Martin with what could only be described as systematic psychological warfare. He'd found Martin's insecurities, his sensitivity, his intelligence, his background, and weaponized all of it. What Richie saw as motivation and team building, Martin experienced as torture. The investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that went back years, involving multiple players and incidents that had been covered up or ignored. On November 3, 2013, the Dolphins suspended Richie indefinitely. When the Ted Wells report came out on February 14, 2014, it was devastating. The NFL-commissioned investigation found a pattern of bullying and harassment by Incognito, John Jerry, and Mike Pouncey.
The NFL is going to conduct a review of the workplace, and we are going to give, as an organization, our full and complete cooperation.
His reputation, which had always been controversial, was now completely toxic. For the first time in his career, Richie's psychological tactics had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making him stronger, they'd made him unemployable. But here's where Richie's story takes an interesting turn. Instead of disappearing, instead of accepting that his career was over, he decided to fight back. He hired lawyers, granted interviews, and tried to tell his side of the story. Whether you believed him or not, one thing was clear: Richie wasn't going away quietly. He spent all of 2014 out of football, working with therapists, anger management specialists, and anyone who could help him understand what had gone wrong. He has discussed seeking help and experiencing dark days during this period. It was the first time in his career that Richie had been forced to examine the psychological warfare that had defined his game. On February 7, 2015, the Buffalo Bills took a chance on him. Coach Rex Ryan thought he could provide veteran leadership and help anchor their offensive line.
I'm excited to have him on my team.
It was a risky move, but it paid off immediately. The Bills' offensive line, which had been a weakness for years, suddenly became one of their strengths. And Richie was different. He was still intense, still competitive, still that psychological warrior who could get inside opponents' heads. But now there was wisdom behind it, strategy rather than chaos. He'd learned to channel his mental games in a way that helped his team without destroying individuals. The Bills made the playoffs in 2017 for the first time in 17 years, ending the longest playoff drought in major North American sports. Richie made the Pro Bowl in 2015, 2016, and 2017, proving that his controversial past hadn't diminished his ability to dominate on the field. But more importantly, he'd shown that he could evolve, that the psychological intensity that had once been his downfall could be redirected into something positive. In Buffalo, Richie found the perfect balance. He was still the guy who would research opponents all week, still the player who could find your mental weakness and exploit it. But now he was doing it with precision rather than with reckless abandon. Opponents still hated playing against him, but now it was because he was so effective, not because he was out of control. The stories from his Buffalo years show how he'd perfected his craft. Before games, he'd study film, not just for football tendencies, but for psychological tells. He'd notice which players got frustrated easily, which ones lost focus when they were tired, which ones could be baited into making mistakes. Then, during games, he'd use all of that information to gain every possible advantage. But it wasn't just about messing with opponents anymore. Richie had become a mentor to younger players, teaching them the mental side of the game that most coaches never talked about. He'd share techniques for staying calm under pressure, for reading defensive signals, for understanding the psychological ebb and flow of a game. On April 12, 2018, Richie announced his retirement and was placed on Buffalo's reserve retired list. By May, he was officially released. His Bills chapter, a redemption story for the ages, seemed complete. But retirement didn't stick. In May 2019, the Las Vegas Raiders signed him, believing they could benefit from his veteran presence. However, the NFL suspended him 2 games for a 2018 incident at an Arizona funeral home, where he had pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct.
Former NFL star arrested at a funeral home accused of going on a rampage following the death of his father.
He started 12 games in 2019, showing he could still play at an elite level despite being in his mid-30s. But Father Time was finally catching up. Injuries that he'd played through for years were finally taking their toll. He missed most of 2020 and 2021 with injuries, and when he was on the field, he wasn't quite the same dominant force he'd been. On July 15, 2022, Richie Incognito officially retired from the NFL after 13 seasons. Looking back on Richie's career, it's impossible to separate the player from the person, the talent from the controversy. He was simultaneously one of the most dominant offensive linemen of his generation and one of the most polarizing figures in NFL history. Teammates either loved him or couldn't stand him. Opponents respected his ability while hating his methods. Coaches appreciated his intelligence while worrying about his intensity.
We like where he is, we like what he's done, and we like the potential of what
But there's no denying his impact on the game. Richie changed how teams thought about the psychological aspect of football. He showed that mental warfare could be just as effective as physical dominance, that getting inside someone's head could be more devastating than any block or tackle. His legacy is complicated, and it probably always will be. The Jonathan Martin incident will forever be part of his story, a reminder of what happens when psychological intensity crosses the line into something darker. But his comeback in Buffalo showed that people can change, that even the most controversial figures can find redemption if they're willing to do the work. Whether you loved him or hated him, whether you thought he was a genius or a bully, one thing was undeniable. Richie Incognito was one of the most complete psychological warriors the NFL has ever seen. He could break down your mental defenses, exploit your deepest fears, and turn your own thoughts against you. And he did it all while playing at a Pro Bowl level for over a decade. In the end, Richie Incognito's career was defined by one simple truth. Football is as much a mental game as it is a physical one. And nobody, absolutely nobody, understood that better than the most feared psychological warrior in NFL history. He was controversial, he was complicated, but he was undeniably one of the most mentally dominant players in NFL history. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most mind-game players the NFL has ever seen, stick with Endzone Exposed, subscribe, and check out some of our other content right here. Because the mental side of sports is just as fascinating as what happens between the lines.